There's research that says every child is a genius until they go to school. And so the idea is within each one of us is creativity and solutions to things that no one's come up with yet, and the ability to design things that no one's thought of yet. Within each one of us is an element of genius. Where does it go away? It goes away when we start to feed people into an education system that expects production instead of identity. Now, there's a balance. People need to learn how to produce. They need to learn how to produce not because it's required for you to be okay or to be accepted. They need to learn how to produce because it's how you become the best version of yourself.
All right. Hey, y'all, it's Danny C. Welcome to the Happy Life Agenda podcast. This is an episode you do not want to miss. So turn up the volume and tune in because we are going to dive deep into the masculine and feminine archetypes. This is a topic that hits to the very heart of the mission of the Happy Life Agenda. I have a goal to live in a world where men and women work in partnership. We leverage each other's innate characteristics across all parts of the societal structure, and we're going to raise up a new generation that's equipped to take on the physical and mental challenges that life requires. So when you hear this talk, you're going to understand why there is a current imbalance of societal structure, and it's stealing our joy. It's causing an epidemic of anxiety. So all that said, I am so excited to welcome my guest today, Bob Hamp. He is a licensed and marriage family therapist with over 30 years in practice, founder of the Think Differently Academy. He is a globally renowned speaker and author of 3 life-changing books, which you must get. I'll be sure and have them in his bio. And look at them. They're right there behind him. He is also a leadership consultant for a number of large and small organizations throughout the country, and he has been a pivotal mentor in my journey to the Happy Life Agenda. So welcome, Bob. I'm just so ecstatic that you're here, and we are going to dive deep into this conversation today. So before we get started.
Yeah, I'm pretty excited to be here too, because we've had lots of conversation about this. I'm looking forward to this one.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Well, tell us a little bit about you and some of your current projects before we dive in.
My word. Well, current project, we are just about a week away from leaving for our yearly month away in the Bahamas. But one of the things we do there is we invite some couples to join us midway and do a marriage retreat for couples that are wanting to enrich their marriage. But I'm also really digging into these days the issue of identity. I've done both some teaching in a couple different areas, but also I've created an online course called Decoding Identity. And in that course, we're really digging deep into how do we understand who we are with a view to the nature of reality. In other words, the creation of the human soul, what's the nature of reality, and then how do we figure out with those two things together what's true about me, and therefore what's the path ahead of me. I think so often we think I'll do what I want to do to figure out who I am instead of figuring out who I am, and from that, growing the path. And so really digging deep into the area of identity these days.
Wow, that's such an important part of this. I know I'm going to have you back on to have that conversation because living as your authentic self is key to that. And I think it will kind of be interwoven into our conversation today. So let's go ahead and get started on this masculine, feminine archetypes, because this conversation has come up so many times over the last few weeks, and I would even say months. And even in some of the businesses that I've worked with, it's kind of that imbalance that a lot of these companies are struggling with. So let's start with the definition of masculine and feminine archetypes and how we see those play out not only psychologically, but in our biology as well.
Yeah. And in fact, I'm going to actually start by kind of pushing aside some sociological confusion as a part of giving that definition. And what I mean by that is we live in a culture right now where we tend to think male, female, we tend to think man, woman, as opposed to masculine, feminine. Mm-hmm. And so we get confused in both the sexual, gender, sexuality, and even sometimes the social and political definitions that are being tossed about right now. And so if it helps listeners to really set those aside for a moment, understand I'm not talking about I'm a man, you're a woman. I'm talking about, and you use the word archetype. It's a great word. I love that word. It really has to do more with the energy that we carry or the way that we operate. Before I give the definition, I'll tell kind of a funny story. In my early days as a counselor, before I had any clients at all, my office manager used to take calls, and she would say, people would call and say, "Can I have a female counselor?" Well, I was the one whose practice they were trying to build, and they'd say, "Well, we have Bob, and he's really in touch with his feminine side." And at first I was like, what is she saying? Like, what is she really saying to people? But I very much know what she's saying. I don't think there's anything, and this is where I want to kind of strike at the heart of the social definitions. I don't think I present myself in a particular feminine way, but what I am is I'm empathic. I'm in touch with my feelings. I see people as people who are growing and need the nurture that they need to grow. And I work hard to provide the nurture that people need to become who they really are. And all those are feminine traits based on the definition I'm about to give. At the same time, I'm fairly masculine in terms of, I've started a couple businesses. I'm often taking initiative in developing strategies and ideas, concepts. I'm often the one in a group who will kind of take the lead verbally and even conceptually. And so there's a masculine side of that I think complements the feminine side. So definitions.
Right.
The way I think about it, Danielle, is in our creator, there is both masculine and feminine. He would say it this way: I'm both the author and the finisher, or I'm the beginning and the end of your life. Mm-hmm. And I think what we can kind of extrapolate from that is the beginning doesn't just mean here's the point in history where it started. It's kind of like the beginning of a river, right? A river starts from the melting snows in a mountain. And as the water accumulates going down the mountain, this little bit of melting snow becomes this giant river. The mountain and the snow is the beginning. It's not just the beginning point, but it's the source. But when we think of the end, it's also not the point in time where things end. It's the place where things find their fullness. So if we want to continue with the river metaphor, it's where the Mississippi River meets the Gulf of Mexico. And as it meets the Gulf of Mexico, it finds the fullness of its completion. Its journey completes itself as it gives all of its waters and all of its nutrients and all of its life into the Gulf of Mexico. So it's got a beginning and an end. And those two ideas coming from what was inside our creator says to us that when he put inside of us both beginning and end, we can recognize that as the masculine and the feminine.
Oh, wow.
Right. Think of it biologically then. When we conceive a child, the male is the source of the seed, but the female is the one who receives the seed both into her egg, but also into her womb. Mm-hmm. And so the masculine is initiative or the granting of life. The feminine is the one who receives and nurtures and allows that planted seed to come to its fullness. Even after the infant is born, it's fairly stereotypically and culturally common that it's the woman who nurtures the children to become young adults and to, in a healthy setting, to come into the fullness of who they are. So beginning and end isn't just about a point in time. It's about the source and the completion. It's about where things come from, and it's about how things come into their fullness. And so with those definitions, you can see how crucial that is to both individuals, families, and organizations.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You started this conversation saying that you're doing identity work. And so coming into that fullness is that identity work and how important those two pieces are. Wow, that's amazing to hear. So, regardless if you're talking about a family unit, an organization, or individual, as you just said, the influence of each archetype is vital to flourishing. But as a society, we've kind of seen this prioritization or greater value given to the masculine archetype. And I mean, that even dates back to some of the things that you read in the Bible. So can you talk a bit about, the importance of this dual influence and, why the world at large might benefit from a more balanced dynamic?
For sure. The thing you're describing is overall, and, there's some reasons for it, but that doesn't mean that's right. Mm-hmm. Overall, most cultures have become patriarchal over time. And even in the modernization of cultures, you see that patriarchal mindset doesn't shift, it just modernizes. It moves from if the patriarchal mindset is, I'm the one who protects you from the Tyrannosaurus Rex. I'm the one who goes out and kills the buffalo to bring in some meat. I'm the one who, makes sure that you're safe. Mm-hmm. That's kind of where the early sense of that patriarchal mindset comes from. Mm-hmm. But what it doesn't mean, but is too easy to fall into, it doesn't mean that the contribution of the feminine is less than. And in
Right.
fact, one of the things I've described for people is we often think of masculinity as strength. But the problem is that the other side of that doesn't mean that femininity is weakness.
Mhm.
Because when we think about it in terms of the metaphor I used or the literal thing I used earlier, which one takes more strength to conceive the child or to carry the child for 9 months and deliver it into the world?
As a
Right.
mother, I can say the second one.
And I think any reasonable thinking person would say the second one. Now, there is a certain amount of energy involved in the conception. And
Mhm.
again, in a healthy relationship, it's important to understand we've got a healthy construct, and then there's some really unhealthy constructs that are distortions of what we're talking about.
Mhm.
But in a healthy relationship, it takes a certain amount of energy from the masculine to conceive the child. But the one who's really stronger in the sense, in that particular metaphor, is who's the one, even if the husband's off defending them from a Tyrannosaurus Rex or, out capturing buffalo, the wife is still at home letting her body, or the woman's still at home letting her body nurture, strengthen, and knit together the child on the inside. And then, of course, we don't have to go far to talk about the strength of labor, how much strength it takes to go through the process of childbirth and then immediately recover from that and provide nurture from outside the body. And so the mistake we make is we think that physical strength as demonstrated by the masculine is the definition of strength as opposed to one type of strength. That leads us into that kind of imbalance, both culturally and often conversationally, believing that this, overt strength of the masculine is stronger, therefore better, or stronger, therefore dominant. Well, what that leads to then is if the feminine is considered weak, we tend to minimize over time, both mentally, emotionally, and relationally, we minimize the importance of the feminine input. But imagine this. The other metaphor I like to use that I think is helpful to people is if the masculine is a seed, then the feminine is the soil. The necessity of those two things is seed without soil never comes to life. And so the importance of elevating the soil up to equal status with the seed is to say, listen, if the soil's missing nutrients, if the soil's not moist enough, if the soil doesn't have everything it needs to bring that seed to life, then we're actually working against the power of the seed. And so to
Right.
minimize the feminine or to downplay the feminine really puts the masculine at a loss.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would like to kind of break this down a little bit and put it in some real world scenarios. Like I said, the mission of the Happy Life agenda is to get us away from being so patriarchal and to bring both of these to the table and have true equality. And you see it a lot in, organizations, particular. I've, been in corporate America, is that as a woman coming into that space, we're asked to be like men in order to be able to be, good and promoted and all of those types of things and heard, where we still have a family to raise at home and taking care of our children, pouring into our people, and even at the organization, pouring into our teams. But that isn't valued. So, if we start to recognize as an organization or as a family unit, we're too heavy on one side, then, how can organizations recognize that? Let me start with that question.
Yeah. Let me also say, in part of the context of answering that question, you've been in corporate America. I've worked in relatively large churches in America. And there's even kind of a special context there because there's some religious backing to that. And some people have some beliefs about religious systems that also lend towards a patriarchal view. And so what ends up happening is even when women are invited into leadership, you got a patriarchal mindset. But of course, we're modern. And so we invite women into leadership, right? But the difficulty is we invite them, and this is where you really have to make the distinction. We're not talking about I'm a man and you're a woman. We're talking about masculine energy and feminine energy. We're talking about what the masculine gives to the world and what the feminine gives to the world. And so even when the masculine, which the dilemma is the masculine is necessary to start any kind of organization. It starts with vision, it starts with a sense of calling, it starts with a sense of we're going to make something happen. But then in our modern world, we invite women into that. But what we do is we ask them to become masculine. We ask them to bring not what the value of the feminine uh, energy, the feminine archetype is, but we ask them to come in and, while we value women in leadership, what we really want is for you to come in and be just as initiative taking, just as vision oriented. And again, you can be all those things. But if we ask people to do that at the loss of the nurture piece, here's what we have. Think about this for a second. I use the metaphor of seed and soil or of conception. And in both of those settings, you take away the feminine and you have a strong start, but an increasingly challenged growth curve. You have a lot of oomph to get things going, but over time, there's kind of a lot of ideas that don't come to fruition. I talk about having operated in the church world. One of the things we see is a lot of kind of call to become a certain kind of believer, but not a lot of nurture in how to become that.
Ah,
There's a drive to do. There's not much impetus to be. There's a drive to perform, but there's the expectation then is that performance is the whole thing.
right.
And yet, if you have people that are performing but not becoming, at some point the mark of that is burnout. But what you see is just increasing unhappiness, increasing burnout, increasing decay of the relationships. Because again, nurture provides a setting where relationships can be strong. And the other thing that you don't see in a culture where the masculine is stronger and dominates the feminine, the other thing you see is a decrease in emotional intelligence. Well, at the least, we're at a point in history where I've heard a number of different studies say their conclusion is that emotional intelligence is the number one leadership value to create a long-term healthy organization. Why? Because you don't just develop structure and strategy, you develop people.
Right.
If you develop people, they become who they are in your midst and they perform out of identity, not out of expectation.
I'm so glad you brought this up because I've been having a lot of conversations both with men and women and just, it's on LinkedIn, it's making a lot of the headlines, is that a lot of corporations, are like, oh, why can't I find any employees? Why does nobody want to work? All of us as workers are disgruntled. There was a survey at the beginning of the year that, more than half the workforce doesn't enjoy their jobs. And it's all about tasking and performance based on what, someone is telling you to do and checking the boxes. So you just go to work and you're doing 100 tasks and you're never seeing like the big wins or the project come to its full fruition. And on top of that, you're not getting to bring any of yourself into that because you're doing exactly what your boss tells you to do. And so that, we have this dynamic where nobody wants to work because they don't get to be who they are. And then organizations are like, well, why does nobody want to work here? And something has to change or we're all going to be without jobs and organizations.
I wish I could remember. I read something just a day or two ago, and I don't like to quote things without giving credit, but it was basically a conversation between a CEO and his friend. And in that conversation, the CEO was saying, I just don't hire healthy people anymore. And his friend was like, what do you mean? He said, because if I hire healthy people, I can't get them to be focused on work.
Oh, wow.
And the conversation progressed to say, his friend was basically saying, what you're saying is you can't get them to be obsessed. You can't get them to give up on the other part of their life. You can't get them to live with imbalance. You can't get them to be driven and performance focused and not be focused on developing a healthy soul.
Yeah.
And so it was a brilliant conversation because the CEO had essentially come down and said, yeah, I'm just not going to hire healthy people.
Wow. This all again lends to the epidemic of anxiety and stuff because it's constantly this calling to live out your purpose, be who you are. And that is more than just the task oriented stuff at work. And how much better would your work be if you got to come into work and that you got to put into it all the creativity and what you have rather than just okay, I'm going to fill out the numbers on this spreadsheet. I'm going to design this graphic to look just like the brand guidelines say, but you have these ideas that are just dying to get out. And the company loses out on growth and innovation because we don't allow our employees to put their heart and soul in it and kind of meet in the middle.
Yeah. Let's take a minute to talk about the distortions of the masculine and feminine. Because I think it's important to recognize that is the biggest place where we see these two things become imbalanced. It's not just in the elevation of the patriarchal mindset, but it's also in the distortions of the masculine and feminine that we see the feminine minimized.
Okay.
And then
That's great.
talk a little bit about what you were just saying about kind of how people experience that in culture, whether culture socially or culture, in a particular employment setting. The distortions of the masculine, think about it. If the masculine is designed to initiate and take initiative and create, then the distortion of that is dominance and control. All right, dominance and control is using emotions to keep people suppressed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if the feminine is nurture and care that calls people to become the truest version of themselves, then the distortion of the feminine is manipulation.
Wow.
Right? Instead of inviting people to really step and making an emotionally safe place for people to be who they are, the feminine uses emotions against people or uses their own emotions as another form of control or dominance. And so they use emotions as a manipulation instead of a place to make a welcoming place for people to grow. You
Wow.
see this in families when you've got a narcissistic parent, that there's so little room for anybody else to be present emotionally in the family of a narcissist, that the children grow up really struggling to figure out who they are and often end up not really being in relationship with each other because they've been so emotionally deprived that they can only take care of themselves and don't have room for their siblings in their life.
Oh,
And
wow.
so you see that emotional kind of manipulation really kind of takes up a lot of emotional space in our. So here's what I'm after. If the distortion of the masculine is dominance and control, the distortion of the feminine is manipulation and control,
Mm-hmm.
then when people function in organizations where those are the things taking place, here's what we're losing. There's research that says every child is a genius until they go to school.
I've heard that. Mm-hmm.
And so the idea is within each one of us is creativity and solutions to things that no one's come up with yet, and the ability to design things that no one's thought of yet. Within each one of us is an element of genius. Where does it go away? It goes away when we start to feed people into an education system that expects production instead of identity.
Yes.
Now, there's a balance. People need to learn how to produce.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They need to learn how to produce not because it's required for you to be okay or to be accepted. They need to learn how to produce because it's how you become the best version of yourself.
Wow.
And so if people are producing out of fear and expectation, you get a decreasing level of production, not just production, but they are no longer able to be themselves in that setting. They just become your right hand or your servant. You're just doing what you're told, but they're not bringing the fullness of your creativity, collaboration, problem solving capacity. And so what you end up with is people functioning at 25% when they function under masculine or feminine that's distorted. They don't function out of identity, they function out of performance.
Wow. So how does someone, how does a family unit, especially, like I have a young daughter, is how do we look at our situation, maybe know if we're lopsided and make sure that we don't, create this situation where they're just a producer or they're just the kind of lost creative, because we do see that sometimes where they can't really, you see people who just, they have so many ideas, but they can't execute on them. They're fully into being themselves. So how do you help nurture that balance?
Great question. And by the way, the answer is the same in both settings.
Okay.
But let me first of all say one of the ways you'll know that there's a problem, and you can go as far as you want to with this, but kids are a lovely mirror for how well we're parenting them.
We've been talking about that a lot in some podcast episodes.
We don't always like that idea because when our kids mirror back things we don't want to see, we want to think it's them and not us.
Yeah.
And obviously there are times a child may have, a disorder of some sort. They may have but even when children, so I've got a son with Down syndrome and he still mirrors back to me, even at age 40, right? He still mirrors back to me my relational style with him. And if I can erase my judgment of his responses to me, it can become a very helpful way for me to recognize what am I delivering to him based on what I'm getting back from him. There's an old adage in communication theory that says what you're getting back from the people you're communicating with is the meaning of what you're communicating.
Wow.
So whatever you're getting back, you can either go, why are you doing that? Or you can go, how am I planting seeds and how am I nurturing seeds that this is what I get back?
Right.
And so the answer to your question, I'm going to answer it from a parenting standpoint, but I want you and the listeners to both hear this is exactly the same thing in a corporate setting, even in kind of your own personal development. Is one way to describe it is there's got to be love and there's got to be limits. Or another way to say it is there's got to be nurture and there's got to be boundaries.
Gotcha.
The misconception about that is that love doesn't mean we allow people to get away with things. Love means people know that they're valued when they succeed and when they fail. Love means that people know that they're valued for who they are and not what they do.
Right.
And so when they have that, there's a lot of freedom to try. But what are the limits or what are the boundaries? There's misconceptions around boundaries too. Boundaries don't just mean I say yes or I say no. Boundaries mean I'm going to draw a line that if you cross this line, you'll pay a price. And if you stay within this line, you'll gain a benefit.
Gotcha.
But the moment I try to control you, you lose the benefit of boundaries. Because what the boundary does is it teaches a child to control themselves. On this side of the line, you get lots of benefits. Cross that line, it starts to become costly. What would you like to do, son?
Right.
But if what we settle on is you may not cross that line, I'm going to force you to not cross that line, they lose the ability to think for themselves, and they don't get the benefit of, hey, crossing that line isn't the reason why I love you, and not crossing that line doesn't make me not love you. It's just helping you understand the nature of reality. In the world out there, there are certain things that you do that will reap a consequence.
Mm-hmm.
We don't teach our children that early on by learning that a boundary isn't me stopping them from misbehaving.
Mm-hmm.
Boundary is me teaching them how to use their will in the healthiest way possible. Hey, this line is the boundary. On this side, you get benefits. On this side, you have consequences. And
that's powerful.
So I will love you on both sides of the line. So you have love and you have boundaries. And when kids get a healthy version of both of those things, then they grow up with a clear sense of identity and they stay in that place of creativity, innovation, collaboration, all those things when people are living out of the top part of their brain are present when they get healthy love and healthy boundaries. Same exact thing is true in an organization. Now, you may not have the same kind of love for your employees that you do for your child, but what you do is you say, you matter to me, and I will teach you how to do your job, but your value is in your personhood, not in your performance. Now, in a work setting, obviously, if someone can't perform the tasks, you have to be able to say, dude, you matter, but you're in the wrong role.
Looking for their gifts and maybe seeing how you can move them around.
If you're in the wrong role, I'm doing you a disservice to keep you in it.
Exactly.
And you're doing yourself a disservice by trying to please people and stay in a role that doesn't fit. And so what we typically think is, well, performance is the issue and we've got to get them to comply. What if you're trying to ask them to be, what if they're a left brain, thinker and you're asking them to be a creative, artistic person, or the other way around? You're setting both your department and you up for failure if you're asking people to become somebody else in order to meet the requirements of the job.
Absolutely.
Absolutely, they need to meet the requirements of the job, and ideally to a high degree. But the moment you're asking them to step outside of their created design, you're minimizing their ability to give to the organization as well as their ability to grow into the fullness of the creative genius that they were before they went to school.
Right. Oh, wow. That's powerful. I think there's two things to uncover there. Is for the family thing, I want to kind of lay this out for the audiences. I talk to my daughter a lot about choices. I think that's the same as boundaries, is like whatever choice you make in this situation, it's yours. Here's what happens if you make this choice versus here's what happens if you make this choice. And then she knows, the boundary is that if I make this choice, a bad thing will happen. But I think that that's such a powerful thing because, as you said, even growing up in, the 80s and 90s, it was kind of a different dynamic where it was like, do as you're told, and children are meant to be seen and not heard. And so this is a whole new way, but I think it's going to create these little humans that grow up to understand things a little better and come into their fullness of who they are a lot better. And the
Yeah.
other thing is, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was going to say there's a lot of crazy stuff in psychology, but we've lived long enough and studied the human being long enough to know, if you value the autonomy and identity of a person, we understand better how to nurture that today than we have at any point in history. The problem is when the culture doesn't value autonomy and identity, we still use what we know in psychology for harm instead of good.
So our culture needs to catch up. And I guess that's kind of like where this, you're kind of seeing a paradigm shift in the whole world right now. I mean, one of the girls I interviewed on a podcast, she talked about just like even COVID. She said that's the earth trying to tell us and shake us up. Like, things are happening in this universe. So
definitely things are happening. And I think it's important that we question. And one of the things I love about this conversation is we're talking about both the individual, organization, and the culture. And from what you said, even the global culture, we're looking at all that stuff, and we really have to apply the basic principles of human emotional / mental / relational / spiritual health to all 4 levels of that. And love the invitation of this conversation because it's, some foundational pieces of that is who are you? And then who are you relative to the masculine and the feminine?
Yeah.
From that, everything else grows.
Yes. So one of the things I wanted to make sure that we covered is, you said, who are you in relation to the masculine and feminine? And so, most people probably bring a little bit of both to the table. They might be heavier on one side than the other, but then you have a lot of families who either they're a single parent, both parents, or one or the other. So how can a single parent or a family that's got that imbalance, how can they make shifts and promote that missing influence in their kids? Because, you see a lot of behavioral issues and stuff in schools or with certain kids. And it's usually something might be missing in their home and their parents aren't even aware. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, great question, man. I love this conversation. I love that question. The first thing I would say is as you develop a clearer understanding of these 2 archetypes, the masculine and the feminine, there's a degree to which you cannot be completely both of those for your children if you're a single parent.
Okay.
But there's also a degree to which when you understand the 2, sometimes you've got to say to your kid, hey, this is yours. Go do this. I believe in you. You can do this. And sometimes you've got to say, let me hold your hand the first 3 steps. And so learning that you can operate out of both of those things, right? I mentioned earlier, even though I'm fairly masculine in my vision, in my my design of things, my building things in my life, I'm also fairly feminine. Some of that comes from being a counselor. Some of that comes from being raised by a mother, primarily. Wasn't always a single parent, but for the most of my developmental years, she was a single parent. And being raised by a mother, I developed a fairly strong sense of the feminine without having to become effeminate, if that makes sense.
It does.
And so the ability to practice both of those with intention, i.e., what is the masculine? I need to be able to say to my kid, hey, you've got some really great stuff in you. And let me point it out to you. Let me tell you about it. But you have to develop that. I can't do it for you.
Right.
From the feminine side, how can I support you as you do it? What do you need? If they're struggling, give enough validation, but not so much that you're enabling them. And again, probably another helpful part of that is to recognize the dysfunction of the masculine, the dysfunction of the feminine. I think sometimes when you're a single parent, it's easy to fall into those dysfunctions because life feels out of control, you feel out of control, and you're just trying to figure out how to survive with your kid. And so to the degree, this is a super important line, Danielle.
Okay.
To the degree that you believe your kids are there to meet your emotional needs, you will do harm to them.
Wow. What
I mean by that is it's our job as parents to give to their needs. It is not their job to give to us to meet our needs. So when it comes to being a single parent, it's very common to say, man, you really help me in some ways. listen, they can help around the house. It's important that they do. They can, help get some things. They can help with the siblings. It's important that they do that to develop a sense of family. But to the degree that they feel like they're meeting mom's emotional needs or meeting dad's emotional needs, or feel even worse, like they need to meet mom's emotional needs or need to meet dad's emotional needs, you've just reversed the dynamic that creates health in those children.
Oh, wow.
That creates health when they receive from the masculine and the feminine, or when they receive from the feminine. But what doesn't create health, creates the opposite of that, is when the parent needs something from them emotionally and begins to expect the child to provide that emotional need meeting.
Wow.
It's incredibly deteriorating to the child's sense of well-being. Think about it. Just, if the parents are supposed to be caretaking, then one of the things that happens is the child doesn't get what they need. But the second thing that happens is the child then takes the role of the parent, and now they get something they don't need. And that is their own expectation that they can function without what they actually need. And in fact, they're supposed to function without what they need. And so when a parent looks to a child to meet their own emotional needs, there's two significant things that they do to harm the child. They don't give them what they need, and they teach them that they should go ahead and proceed to take care of other people at their own expense.
Wow. I think that could be a whole other conversation, because I have so many questions now. I know we're almost out of time. So do you think that, and I kind of look at this both from a corporate structure and even a family structure, but do you think if, engaging with a grandmother or grandfather, depending on what's missing, or an aunt or an uncle, and bringing them more around to help with that balance at the same time in a corporate structure, is really looking at how your organization is set up and seeing what your strengths your people have, who has the masculine, the feminine, and restructuring how you lay out your departments and your leadership so that you're getting that balance. Are those kind of some solutions?
For sure. Let me address the second thing in a moment. But you jumped on the second piece that I was going to talk about, and that is, in a family, if you're a single mom, it can be very helpful to bring in a male figure, because there is something about that child being able to receive from a male, not just the masculine, but from a male. And in doing that, bringing in that male figure, one of the things that's crucial is you've got to ask yourself the question, how healthy is this male?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Just bringing in a male doesn't create health. Bringing in a healthy male does that, in the same way that bringing in a healthy female does that. Mm-hmm. And so you want to ask the question, if I'm going to bring someone in to influence my kids, my first question isn't about masculine or feminine. My first question is about how healthy are they?
Right.
Second, if I'm a single mom, my next question is going to be, can I find a healthy male who's willing to be an influence in my kids' lives? Sometimes it can be a teacher, coach, and or another family member. Well, let's talk about what you just said about organizations. Within organizations, I think it's crucial to really make the distinction, again, that it's not about men and women only, but about the masculine and the feminine. Mm-hmm. And recognizing you first have to have the value for the feminine in the first place. You first of all have to recognize, if we get the tasks done, but people are dying, we're not going to survive long. And eventually there will be such a problem with morale, which is the word I was trying to think of 20 minutes ago.
Yes.
There will be such a problem with morale that's increasing over time, because the feminine provides that people are welcome to be people here. And as such, as we're working hard, we're also working hard at taking care of the people who are working hard. Mm-hmm. And so not only, this is the answer I wanted to give you, not only is it important to bring people in that can give, like, no CEO is the perfect parent, just like no parent is the perfect parent.
Right. True. Sure.
No HR department is the perfect parent, but to be intentional to say, are my people getting enough sense of self and vision, and are they getting enough care? And to intentionally be sure that if you're not strong in one of those areas, A, you're working on it, but also B, that you involve people who cover your own weaknesses. Wow. It's the valuing of those two things that matters. You can, in your own life, you can work on developing that, but the value of realizing it's not masculine, feminine, it's masculine, feminine.
Right.
And value that we can knit together an organization where people are given significant expectations of performance, but also the capacity. We develop the internal capacity to not just perform, but to sustain and to flourish.
Wow.
Let me hit one more thing because it's really important in this when you apply this to organizations.
Well, I'm going to interrupt you real quick because this is also on audio. So I want to make sure that everyone listening out there knows that when he said masculine, feminine, I kind of went, wow. He's putting his fingers together like puzzle pieces. So when the masculine and feminine have to come together as a dynamic that works together like puzzle pieces. And it's not just about two people going down a track separately. So I think that was important to note. So anybody that's listening on audio.
Nice. Good clarification. I didn't realize it was just audio. Otherwise, I might describe that. But so the other piece that's so important is to understand the feminine's not just about, oh, you're welcome here and I love you. It's not that. Anything that provides safety, security, and ongoing, I'm looking for the right word, hospitality. But let me give an example or two just to say what I'm talking about. In an organization where there's clear structure and healthy processes, that's the feminine at work. I can't tell you in the consulting I've done over the years and the different types of organization I've been to, it's so often true that the visionary people aren't necessarily good at structure and implementation. And yet structure provides a safe environment for people and healthy processes provide a safe environment for people. And by safe, no one's necessarily physically in danger. I'm just saying it provides that environment where you can become more and more yourself. If you know if things are predictable, if processes, communication and appeals and, problem solving the organization are healthy, that provides a nurturing environment. So the feminine isn't just about, oh, you're so welcome here. And look, you're powerful and wonderful.
That's important to note.
Right. It's very much about, is this place a place where people can grow into their fullness? And so structure and process, which are always, when I do my consulting, it's one of the places I start is, let's talk about structure and process.
Mm-hmm.
Because I'm asking the question, but also wanting to ultimately teach to this idea that the masculine may start an organization, but the feminine will develop the processes that allow that organization to grow and sustain over lengths of time.
That's so important. I read, I've talked a lot on my podcast about Jim Collins' Built to Last. And that's one of the things that, he talks about. And you see that and even with clients that I've worked with, is that you come in and you see the CEO has this amazing vision and mission. And so if you can paint that for each person that walks through the door, but then also put some structure behind it and say, like, here's the direction we're moving, here's how we're going to get there. And then as you build that, you unfold the gifts of each individual and you find places where they fit in the structure or the processes, and everything just kind of like moves where people like know what they're coming in for every day and what they're working towards.
Yeah. I've consulted in places that don't have job descriptions, don't have org charts, don't have, people's assignment can change from one day to the next. Who they report to can change from one day to the next. And that lack of consistency or predictability really is a chaotic way for people to live. And in the long run, it really kind of keeps people in the bottom of their brain, in that kind of survival brain, and out of their creative genius self.
Yeah. I've seen a lot of that too. And it would, be beneficial. You can become a fabric of society organization if you make some of these changes to really set expectations, communication, and process and structure, and letting people be who they are can really make the difference.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, Bob, I know we're about out of time, but this has been such a fantastic conversation. I am going to invite all of the listeners out there. I think that you probably have some questions. Be sure to follow us on social and, ask your questions. Go to my website. I have a contact us form because Bob is one of my good friends and has been a great mentor to me. And so I'm sure he would come back on again and answer some of these questions. But before we leave, I would like you to tell everyone, where they can find more information about Think Differently, maybe connect with you. What are your social handles? Can you tell us about that, Bob?
Yeah, my social handles are fairly easy because it's almost always my name.
Perfect.
I'm on X, formerly known as Twitter, as @Bob Hamp. Same thing with Instagram, @Bob Hamp. Facebook, I'm still I've got way too many Facebooks, but you can find me because I'm there. I am on TikTok, but I've barely ever look at it, so don't look for me there. I mean, you can. But most importantly, Think Differently Academy is our website where all of our resources live. And it's tdacad.com. TD, Think Differently, ACAD Academy, tdacad.com. And there are all of our resources about kind of becoming who you're created to be. Also some relational resources, communication resources, even the course that I referenced earlier about identity. That's where that course would be. And pretty much everything we do circulates around that platform.
Wow. All right. Wow. So you guys go to tdacad.com, and I'm going to have this on happylifeagenda.com. I'll have Bob's bio up there and picture with all the resources for you to easily click through if you aren't picking up on this right at the moment or you're driving. Bob, thank you so much for coming. If you guys love this conversation, please click subscribe below and follow us on social media. And until next time, I'll see y'all soon. Have a great day. Thanks, Bob.